Alrighty, here we go, here we go. Thank you for everyone who joined the stream today. As you've probably have seen from the Discord post, this is gonna be the first stream in a series of streams where I would be creating a game using one of the art packs from the asset store, and then just trying to showcase the features of the RTS Engine asset that you all know and love. And I guess I'm just gonna show you what I have imported here. So I just imported this art pack from the asset store, which I will be linking to in the chat a little bit later. Wait, I can just link to it right now. Fantasy pack. It's a really nice asset. It has building models, unit models, some animations, and as well as it looks really cool. 1 second. This is the link to the art pack. Right here. And so we just have like a couple of buildings here, some walls which we can use later to build to use with the advanced building placement module with the RTS engine. It also has this little gate here, and I think some of the buildings also have some upgrades, so we'll be able to showcase a lot of the RTS engine features with this asset here. And maybe at one point we'll also add a module for water, and we'll have some ships and some docks. There's a lot of potential with this asset is what I'm trying to say. But we also have the one and only RTS engine asset right here imported, the latest version from the asset store. And I guess in this stream I'm just gonna follow the initial documents in the manual, where we set up a new map scene, and we set up the terrain, and we set up some faction slots, and then get into creating some buildings. So just an initial introduction on how to use the RTS engine as a new user, as a beginner. And we'll make sure to have this stream later on YouTube or here as a VOD on Twitch, so you guys can follow along, and this will hopefully be serving as a video tutorial series as well. One second. Turn your mic up, we can't hear you, very quiet. Oh, alrighty. I also don't have the chat right next to me, which I'm just trying to figure out as well. So this is gonna be fun. Is this better for the volume? Alrighty, I think this is better now, so we can go ahead and start. Right. Just 1 second. Let me pull up the chat next to me so I can also read what you guys have to say. Will you upload the stream later? Yes, this will be available as a VOD later, and most probably also on YouTube. And if we can get like some bits out of it, then I'll chop it up into like individual smaller tutorials on YouTube. Alrighty, let's go ahead then and just start a new scene. This will serve as the map scene. So in the RTS engine, each map is saved into an individual scene, which we call a map scene. So let's go ahead and create an empty scene here. And the first step you want to do when creating an RTS engine map scene is you would go to the top menu up here, top menu bar, and then you'll just click configure new map scene. Alright, for this project, for the RTS engine, we also require Text Mesh Pro for the UI, for the text, and so let's go ahead and import that and hope it's not gonna take super long. I am a bit quiet again. Alright. Is this better? Can we confirm whether this is better in terms of sound? Alright. I think. Yeah, so since we have text mesh imported right now, we're just gonna go ahead and take a look at the content of the RTS engine map scene, which were just imported right here. So we have the GameManager, which is the main component in the RTS engine. It has all of the global settings, including the current game version, which you can set so that you can have different map scenes for different versions for your game, and enforce that in the lobby menus, which we'll get to probably in a later stream. We have the defeat condition, how is a faction will be marked as defeated, whether you eliminate the main entities of that faction, which we will get to later. You can just specify those elements either straight from the prefabs or the game objects that you have spawned in the scene, or you just eliminate all of the elements, or you can also have a custom defeat condition, which you can call through your custom logic here. The peacetime duration is in seconds. It's the amount of time during which no faction can attack each other, and it's a classic feature in RTS games where you want to make sure that the players will build up their economies and their territories before they actually engage in any combat. Some audio clips here, and we have the faction slots that the game has right here. And in this example, we only have one faction slot. When we expand that, we can look at the data of that faction slot. The role is the host, which is usually the main player. In a local game, that's usually the human player and not the AI. We have the NPC, and client is usually used for multiplayer games, but you don't have to set that here. And just a simple name for the faction, the color, and the type of the faction, which we'll also kind of get to later, and the NPC type, and some just global settings. And here it is important to mark this faction as a local player so that it's controlled by the player, pretty much. And this is the initial camera look at position, so when the game starts, the camera will be looking at this building right here. When we look at the initial factions, we have these are the entities that are present in the scene already when the game starts, and you assign these entities to specific faction slots so that when the game starts, they are initialized as belonging to that faction slot. And you can have type specific initial entities, so you choose depending on the faction type that you choose. You can have different faction entities that spawn for the player. In this case, we choose the faction type right here already, but if the game is starting from a lobby where the player can actually pick their faction type, it will be overridden in this field here, and so the type specific initial faction entities would come in useful. The same thing will also happen to the NPC type, which can get overridden if we're coming from a lobby, and pretty much all of the other settings too. Yeah, so that's for the initial faction entities and the faction slots. When we take a look at the hierarchy here, we have some some components that are necessary for the RTS engine to run, and these are usually under essential right here. So we have some components for login, for preserving determinism in the game, for handling the game events, for handling selection, for effect objects, for upgrades, audio, and all of this nice stuff. And all of these components here you cannot delete, you need to have those for the RTS engine to run properly. And then we have some components that are optional and that are coming from modules. So we have some additional selection components, like a box selector, for example. I can just like remove it here and start the game and there will be no issues, but that feature will be missing. The minimap is also an optional part of the RTS engine, so you can choose to have it or not, depending on how you want the game to run. We also have the UI. The whole UI system in the RTS engine is also optional, so you can delete this and write your own. It's also based on events that are fired from each of the RTS engine components, and so that allows you to build your own UI depending on what your game requires. We also have some faction specific optional modules, and we also have this save game object, which currently has no scripts because I have not imported the save system module, but usually that module will overwrite all of these scripts, these missing scripts here, and you'll be able to save and load your game. Otherwise, there's nothing here on the demo empty game object, which usually would have some specific components that were necessary for the demo game in the RTS engine. And then we have the DevTools components, which has some stuff that allow you, for example, this component allows you to just complete any pending task immediately without having to wait for time, and this one allows to autocomplete building constructions, and these are specific components that you really don't want into your end game, but they're just useful if you're debugging some stuff. So that is about the organization here in the main components of the RTS engine. The next thing we see here is the terrain, which is in this case a very simple plane with a box collider. So in the RTS engine you can have any type of object that you can use as a terrain. The important thing here is that it has a collider, and it has a specific layer that is defined in the terrain area that you want it to be represented. We also have some hidden air terrain here and just the directional light for the scene. The resource entities game object is a parent game object for all of the pre-placed resource entities. So like your trees, your rocks, whatever resource entities that the resource collectors can collect resources from, you just place them here, and then we will later see when we go to the resource extension, we have the resource manager here. You usually assign that parent object here so that it recognizes it and it looks for its children objects and it finds the resource entities and when the game starts and then initializes them. The other alternative would be to look throughout the whole scene, which will probably gonna take more load time for the actual scene to start. So we resort to having a parent object for these objects here, for the resource entities. And finally, we have the faction entities. The faction entities, which are the units and buildings that the player would start with. And as we saw earlier here in the faction slot, we have the host faction slot, and it has two initial faction entities, which are just the default building and the default unit. And as we can see here in the faction slot of the host player, we have the initial camera look at position at the building here. So when the game starts, it's going to be looking at the building. So yeah, let's go ahead and just save the scene first so that we don't lose any of our progress. Just gonna save it here under game. demo. Alrighty. So now that we have this saved, let's just start the game. So now we did not make any modifications. We just imported the the new map configurations here, and we just have these objects without modifying anything. Let's just start the scene and see what happens. We're gonna give Unity a little bit of time. Alrighty. So now we can look, probably let's hide all of these warnings. We have a bunch of errors which are telling us, and a very good tip is to know whether the error is coming straight from the RTS Engine components or from the other Unity components or your own components, is that they're usually preceded with this RTS Engine here between the two stars, and then there's the RTS Engine component that is actually printing this error. And what it's telling us here is that it's unable to find the layer for the name-based terrain, and it's also unable to find the layer for the entity selection, and it's unable to find a few other layers. And it's telling us that if you are running this for the first time, then we have to import the demo layers from the RTS Engine top bar menu. So these layers are the layers that have been defined for the demo game, but you can also define different layers. But this new RTS Engine map configuration requires you to have these layers at least. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go to the RTS Engine top bar menu here, and then we're just gonna click on configure demo layers. And when we do that, we can go to the tags and layers inspector, and we can see we have some new layers here: ground terrain, obstacles, entity selection. We don't need to know what they're all about right now, but we just need to have them at the moment. Click on save to save the project, and then let's go ahead and start the game again. And we have no errors, so that's fixed, and that's really nice. We can move in the scene with the camera. We can see that there's pretty much nothing in the scene here, but we're able to select this unit, which is the default RTS Engine unit, and we can also select the building right here, which currently has 1 health and it's not built. But I think it's only natural if we can only just like move the unit with a right click, which doesn't respond to anything at the moment, and that's because we don't really have a navigation. We haven't really baked the navigation mesh yet. So for that, let's close the scene. We will go to the window in the top bar menu, and we'll just like find AI and then click on navigation. Now we have our navigation tab, and we just need to bake this area as a walkable area. So our terrain right now is a pretty simple plane. It's not really that hard to just bake the terrain for it, so we're just gonna bake it with the default settings. And one tip: when you're baking your terrains, you usually want to have the units and the buildings and the resource entities, usually want to have them turned off, because they usually have some navigation mesh obstacles, which when you bake the navigation mesh, when they're activated, they're going to create like a bigger outline for the obstacle than it is already defined for them in the prefabs. So what we want to do is select both of these entities. We just turn them off, and then we go to the navigation tab and we just click on bake. And now, as you can see, our simple plain terrain has a navigation mesh baked into it. And we go back to our building and unit, and we enable them now. And now when we go back to the navigation tab, we can see how the building here has defined a certain obstacle that units will not be walking through. Now let's save the game and we start again. And the unit is now moving. Well, great. So these are usually the first few steps that you want to take. First, when you import the asset for the first time, you want to import the demo layers. Then you want to configure your map scene with a RTS Engine configuration, so it imports all of the necessary components that you need. And then you just want to bake the navigation mesh for your terrain, or maybe just like import your terrain first and then bake the navigation mesh for it while having all of the unit, building, and resource entities turned off, just to have a more exact navigation mesh. Alright, so right now we looked at the RTS Engine hierarchy, we looked at all of the necessary objects. Why not, since we're going to build the game with the RTS pack, with the art pack that we seen in the beginning of the stream, we're just gonna go back there now, we're gonna load that scene. I'll just probably take the terrain from there and just have it over. So this should be the terrain. Does it have a prefab? No, it just has this water thing here. Alright, well, at the moment there's no water. This is the building, Okay. We're just gonna take this terrain and we're gonna go to the folder that we created for this demo game. We're just gonna create terrain, then probably prefabs, and we're just gonna import this terrain as a prefab. Then we're gonna go back to our scene, not gonna save that demo scene there, and we'll just import this terrain into the game here. Not really sure about the water and why it's not appearing in here. Must be some problem with the shader, but for now we don't really care about the water. We're just gonna use a specific part of this terrain. Just gonna bring it right here. We're gonna hide the water object for now because we don't really need that. And we're gonna take our faction entities. Alright, let's bring the terrain down a little bit here. Maybe somewhere like this. We're just gonna delete this terrain that we have by default. And we want to make sure that our objects are not floating in the air, so we probably just like bring this up a little bit. That's good. And I just want to move them away into this corner. Or you know what, we can just like keep them there. There's no rush at the moment to move them away. Alright. we probably want to also bring out the lighting settings from the other demo scene, because it looks so bright in here. So we might just want to steal that for our own scene. Just gonna go to the terrain prefabs, and we're just gonna bring the global volume here and the directional lights. Your terrain. It has a missing script, which we'll just remove and add as a prefab right here. Now we're gonna go back to our map scene and just import the directional light and import the global volume. We're just gonna have those as children objects of the terrain here. Great. Yeah. All right. So right now we still have the navigation mesh that has been baked for the other terrain. So we need to actually bake it again for our new terrain. And let's see what happens. All right. So now we have a new navigation mesh for this new terrain. And let's start the game and see if we can still move the unit or not. Let's go Unity. All right, we actually have a problem here. And the problem is that as soon as we started the game, our faction entities have been... Oh, they're still disabled. Oh, alright, we should have those enabled. Yep, we disabled those so that we can bake the navigation scene. The navigation mesh, sorry. But now let's have them enabled again. And here we go. We have our units, which we can move, but no, we can't really move it. And now the unit is unmovable again, but we just bake the navigation mesh. So the terrain here has to be defined as a terrain area so that it is recognized by the unit so that it can move to. The other terrain that came with the RTS Engine map configuration, it had the correct layers on it, and so the unit was able to recognize that as a valid terrain area and move in it. But this one here, it has the default layer. And so when we go to the unit here and we open up its components, we go to the unit movement and look at the inspector and have the movement tab open. We see that it has no movable terrain areas. And for that, we need to define a couple of movable terrain areas for it. We go back to the GameManager under Essential, under Terrain, and then we look at the Terrain Manager here. And we find that it has two areas. So the map scene only recognizes those two terrain areas. So any other object that is defined by another terrain area is not going to be recognized by the scene or the units in it. And this scene uses the demo game ground and air terrains, which when we click on here and then go to the project tab and click on, we can see that it has a unique key called ground, and it has a ground terrain layer defined to it. So any object in the scene that has that layer will be belonging to our ground terrain area type. And it also has the navigation areas, which we define here using the navigation area indexes that are used on this terrain area. So 0 here would correspond to our navigation tab areas, built-in area 0, which has this color code, which we can see here is baked. So that's the ground terrain, the default one. And a quick fix for this would be to just go out to our terrain and then assign the ground terrain area to it. and here it's asking us whether we want to have the layer be set for all of the children objects too. We don't really want that because it's only the parent object that we're looking for. All of the other children objects are also not actual meshes, so it wouldn't really matter, but we just want this object only anyway. Let's save that. And start the game, which Unity always takes quite some time to do so. But yeah, select the unit, and now it's moving. Alright, so that was a quick fix, but you might have noticed earlier when we went to the unit, this default unit, and we went to the unit movement component, and specifically the movement tab here, it had no movable terrain area. So you might ask yourself, how was it able to move there? And if we go to the tooltip here, we can see that in the second sentence it says leave empty to allow all terrain areas type registered in the TerrainManager to be recognized by this unit movement component. So when we have no items assigned in this list, it's able to move throughout all of the terrain areas that we defined in the TerrainManager, which we have 2 of those, which is not a good setting here because we have an air terrain, and if we would have baked a navigation mesh for an air terrain and assigned some terrain objects to it, then yeah, it will also be able to move through the air terrain. So just as an experiment, we can go back to the movement tab here and just add, yeah, this is an air unit, for example, and then we'll try to move it through our ground terrain. And it is still moving, which should not be happening. We can take a look at the air terrain here, and it has these areas here selected. Also, no errors there. Do we have an object with the air terrain? Shouldn't be, no. Also no navigation area. Yeah, well, this should not be happening, which will be revised later after the stream. It's probably a minor bug, but yeah, we have our units. Let's keep it this way for now. We're just gonna dig deeper right now into the terrain area types. Let me just write down this as a note so that I can take a look at it after the stream. Yeah. Give me a second. Terrain areas. Alrighty. Big Poppy is asking why it shouldn't be moving. Well, if we go back to the unit movement here under the movable terrain areas, we define here the terrain area types that the unit is able to move within. And here we've put air terrain, which we currently don't have an air terrain in our scene. We only have this terrain, which is defined as a ground terrain using that layer. And the RTS engine recognizes it as a terrain area type that belongs to ground, because in our terrain areas that are defined into the TerrainManager, we choose that as the layer belonging to that terrain area. So when we assign air here and we don't have any object that is defined within that terrain area, it should not be moving. But in this case, it is moving, so which shouldn't be happening. Yeah, I guess it really has to do with the area mask here for the navigation mesh agent, which this part here is not part of the RTS engine. It is part of Unity's navigation mesh. system. But even in that case, even if the navigation mesh agent would allow the unit to move throughout the built-in areas or the areas that are defined by the mesh that are not defined by the RTS engine, it should not allow that movement anyway. So, for example, if we take off the walkable here and then have it with the air, it's not gonna move. But in this case, we also get an error from Unity's navigation system, which tells us that it can only be called when it's placed on a nav mesh. And while it is technically placed on a nav mesh, it's not placed on a nav mesh that it is defined its area mask right here. So we might just want to have this assigned to walkable at the moment. The RTS engine should also define pick that as an error and then print it instead of allowing the unit to move. And we're just gonna delete this. But right now we're gonna take a closer look at the terrain areas, and we're just gonna try to create one for our game. So we're gonna go to the project tab here, and under terrain we're just gonna create a folder called areas. And to create a new terrain area, we just want to go to right click on the project tab, create RTS engine, and then we go to terrain area type. And this one, we're just gonna call it live demo ground, something like that. And here we have to make sure that it has a unique key among all of the other terrain areas that we have. And we are just gonna pick a layer, one of the default layers that we have imported from the RTS engine as the layer that defines this terrain area. And for the navigation areas, we're gonna make sure that it also has to match the navigation areas with index 0, which are the walkable ones that are color coded in blue. So we're gonna save that here. And we also have this setting called the test height offset, which is the RTS engine. Whenever any new map scene starts, it has it does caching for all of the heights of the terrain areas that are defined in the game. So when we go to the terrain area manager here, we can take a look at these lower and left corners and upper right corners, and in here we actually can define the coordinates from which the RTS engine will sample the heights of the terrains that we have, so that whenever units are moving or we place in a new building or we require the height, we don't use the expensive physics raycasting. We just like refer to a built-in dictionary that is instantly accessible and returns the closest height information that we have depending on the position that we give it to. And these are other settings for the height caching, but we're just gonna go back to this in a bit. So we have created our new terrain area. It also has a base height of 0, which is usually the height of the terrain, like the base height of the terrain, since it can be a terrain object and it can have mountains, hills, or holes or whatever. And it needs to have like the base height is usually the approximate height at which most of the points in the terrain are at. So it's just an approximation to help with the height caching as well, and it's not really, doesn't have to be that exact. Yeah, now back to our terrain manager. We're just gonna get rid of these demo game terrains, and we're just gonna add our own live demo ground terrain here. And yeah, so the first thing we have to look at in the terrain manager after the terrain areas is the map size. Here is just an approximation that the NPC factions use, which we'll probably get into like in a much later time, not today obviously, but the NPC factions use this map size to determine whether, like, how much territory they have in relation to the current map, and how much territory they need to expand to based on the settings that you choose to have for them. So you can have an NPC faction that wants to aggressively take territories, and others that do not want to do that, and you usually assign a target ratio of the whole map size that they want to control, and they work over the course of the game to achieve that. And this number here helps them to do it. And so in our case here, it's really not important, and it was just calculated by multiplying the length and the width of the default terrain that comes with the RTS Engine map configuration. The interesting part here is the height caching. And if we go down here a little bit, we can see we have gizmos for the height cache area. And so at the moment, our terrain is much bigger than the height cache area that is highlighted in the color green right here. And it's only a part of it, and some of the parts are also just like not caching anything outside of here. And so what we want to do is we want to update these lower left and upper right corners to fit the current terrain that we have. And we can always make them just a little bit bigger, so we have our exact calculations right here. Like maybe -2, yeah, that works. And then for the upper right corner, I'm gonna have to make this a little bit bigger too, so probably 180 or 170. 178 works. Probably 78. And then 200 for this. And now we can see that our whole terrain is included within the height caching area. So like I was saying earlier, the height caching is useful because it recognizes at each point of the map what the height is, so that we don't have to keep using the expensive raycasting physics raycasting method every time we have to determine the height. Oh, hello Charlie. Nice to have you here. Yeah, so after making sure that our whole map is within the height cache area, we have this height cache distance. And so what it says here is, starting from the lower left corner of the map, we move by this distance value to cache height values each time until reaching the upper right corner of the map. So the smaller this distance is, the more height cache values that we have. And so depending on how big your unit objects are, how big the building objects are, and how big your terrain is, you can choose a sweet spot for this value. And in my case, I would think that the default value of 1 is actually good. And the less this value is, the lower it is, the more height caches and the more exact the height caching will happen. Because if we have, let's probably paint this in a more simple way. This one should be -2. Alrighty, maybe 0. Yeah, let's go to the corner right here and then give it a smaller size. Probably just move it right here. So let's say this one is at these positions here, this cube -300 in the position. And when we have caching with a distance of 1 for the heights, it's gonna cache this position, the height at this position, which would be a raycast that is coming above this this terrain here, and then it goes down until it hits it, and it hits it with its terrain collider. So, and it recognizes it because it has the ground terrain area. And with a height cache distance of 1, the next caching will only occur at this position right here. So when we have, let's say, a position between those two here, where we want to find the height of without having to use the raycasting, because we need to determine the heights during the course of the game a lot of times, it's gonna revert to this one right here. And when we have a position right after this second cube, it's gonna revert to the height right here. So say we have a height distance of 0.5, then it will be, the height caching will be more exact. So a position right here will revert to the height on this cube, a position right here will revert to this height on this cube, and a position right here will revert to this cube. So if you have a lot of hills and mountains and steep areas in your terrain, then you might want to play with this height caching value, so you have natural results. But it almost always will save you a lot of performance, since if you have a lot of units and they want to move to a certain position, they all need to find the height of that position, because it's easy to get the X and Z positions from the mouse click, but then the height is a little bit tricky, especially when building a formation movement for that. So yeah, we're just gonna keep the height distance for 1, and that should be it. And as for the next setting, for the height cache sample offset, this one right here is the height caching occurs by sending multiple physics raycasts downwards onto the terrain. And so say our terrain here has a position of -2. We thought the terrain manager is that we want to go to a position at height at y position 10, and then we're gonna send a raycast downwards with length infinity, and that will make sure that we're gonna hit our terrain down there. And so imagine if we have like an air terrain which is placed at a height of 12, the height caching will not really work here because the offset is at 10, so we might want to have a value bigger than 12. But the length of the raycast here is always infinity, so as long as the offset is above the terrain height, the base terrain height, or like the highest point in that terrain, it will always hit it, since it's going down with a length of infinity. And yeah, and maybe now we can also go back to our unit under the unit movement script, and we're just gonna add this live demo ground. And just to make sure that everything is working correctly, we're gonna start the scene. And our unit is moving correctly. That's really nice. Alright, we're just gonna take a look at the rest of the settings on the base terrain over here. So the base terrain is a predefined layer in the RTS engine, so you don't really have to create any terrain object here or anything. It's probably better if I start the game and then show you with the gizmos how it looks. Starting the game again. We're going back to the game scene. And then let's take a look at our map. So if you see this blue rectangle, when we select our terrain manager, we see this gizmo here. This is the base terrain, and the base terrain is something that is not supposed to, it's not supposed to work as a terrain that is usable by units or recognizable by them to move to. It is just there for the RTS engine to make its calculations. For example, it is used to determine what is the boundaries that the camera is currently looking at, and that happens using raycasts from the camera corners into the space terrain. So say if we have a a ground terrain that has like a lot of hills and mountains and stuff like that, that will not be accurate. We really need the flat terrain to raycast the camera corners onto, so that we have a good idea what are the objects, what are the units or the buildings or the resources that the player is currently looking at. And that is also then used for the box selection, because it needs to know what are the units on the screen, and it also needs to know to map the selection. This box selector right here, it needs to map all of its corners into something that's flat so that it can make the correct calculations. And so this terrain, you don't have to create it, you just have to set its settings. And there's also a case where you would have a camera that can rotate in different directions like this. And for this, we also still need to know what are the objects that are currently visible by the camera or also by this box selector. And as we can see here, the box selector has two corners which are not mapped into the ground terrain. And it's not mapped into a terrain that is flat on the bottom, but it's mapped onto a different type of a different component of the base terrain, which we can see right here when we open the terrain object here. We can see that it has a bottom, a flat bottom terrain, and then other base terrain colliders in every direction, so that in this case we can still make our calculations with the box selection and recognizing which game objects are currently in the screen. Hello, Sarkar. I'm an old man with 40. Can you set your voice louder? I am actually, I don't know how to do that. I'm not sure if my mic is not really that good and it's not picking up very loud. I'm gonna try to play with the settings a little bit, but yeah, I probably try to speak a little bit louder too, so that's probably gonna help, but I am not sure I am able to find the correct settings for my mic at the moment. So yeah, my apologies for that. Okay, now it's great. Okay, I think I was speaking a little bit further away from the mic earlier, and yeah. Alrighty, back to the TerrainManager. So yeah, as we said, like this base terrain is not something that you create. You just input the settings and how big it is, and you usually want to have it like much bigger than the actual terrains that you have in your scene, so that whenever you move your camera to the edges of your terrain, you can still see further away, and the raycasts that occur from the box selection or from the camera corners will always hit a collider. So yeah, just assign a layer to it and make sure that this layer is not used by any other object, because that will mess up all of the calculations that we were talking about. And yeah, we pick a center for this base terrain. So we can probably try to center it because it doesn't look that centered to me. We can just like move it a little bit like this. Maybe give it like 75 here, 75 there. And then I think its size is actually good, 700 maybe. Since this is a bigger map, we can just like make it a little bit bigger. And camera boundaries to base terrain margin. And this setting, the hit margin value allows to widen main camera's mount. Oh yeah, so for this setting, we usually don't want to take the main camera corners exactly, and we just like want to take a specific margin up and down. And by trial and error or by experience, when you have a camera that has a 45 degrees on the y-axis, we usually want to have an upper margin that's like reasonable, like 10, and then on the bottom margin we want to have a very big value, else there will be problems with actually hitting the raycasts onto the base terrain right here. But when we have a camera that has a 90 degrees like this, then you usually, like you have a view from above, you usually want to have two like small margin values for the upper and bottom camera boundaries. And yeah, and the last setting here is with enabling this side-based terrain, which you should enable if the camera can be rotated to not face the bottom at all times. And yep, that was it for our terrain creation. Now we have created a new air terrain. We have made sure that all of the our new terrain that we brought from the art pack is has the heights cached correctly, and we have our base terrain defined correctly as well. So what we want to do next is probably start with working on the faction slots, or maybe before we actually do that, we can try, I think before we can do the, oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. So, since we have a new terrain and a new terrain size, we should also talk about like the grid search handler. So one of the techniques that the RTS engine uses to save some time during runtime is by caching heights. There is another trick, let's call it, which is on units or entities, they usually have some sort of automatic behavior, so that if the unit can collect resources, it can look for resources on its own within a certain range, and it can find them, and then it can start collecting them. So this is a setting that you can enable for resource collectors. But in case you have multiple resources on the scene, and then the range is much the range of the search for the unit to look for resources is small, then the unit usually would have to go through the search by looking at all of them, just like searching through all of the resources in the scene, which usually takes a long time. And that is why I've implemented this solution, which I found has improved performance on a bigger scale, which is the grid search. So the grid search means that, let's say, let's bring this unit somewhere else, and yeah, maybe let's lock this right here and move the unit a little bit in the middle. All right, back to the grid search. So let's say this unit has a this resource collector component which can find resources on its own, and it has a size for a range for its search that is a little bit bigger than this square that the unit is currently in. So the grid search handler will only allow the unit to look at the current square that the unit is in, that cell, and it looks at all of the resource entities there. And if it can't find any, then it will look at all of the neighboring cells. And since all of the neighboring cells have the same distance to the current cell that the unit is in, all of the neighboring cells will be looked at, all of the resource entities in there will be inspected, and the valid ones will be given to the unit, and then it will choose the closest one. So if it doesn't really find anything inside of the current cell that it is, which if there is, then that will be the closest, it looks at the neighboring cells. Or it usually looks at the cells and the neighboring cells, and then it goes outwards. So yeah, this would allow the search time to be much lower, because imagine we have a couple of resources in other areas of the map, and this allows the unit to just not look at those because they're too far away from its search range, and we gained a lot of time. Because imagine we have like multiple units, each one with multiple components, like attack components, resource collection, builder components, and they're all within specific timers, they're all looking for targets, and that can get very heavy. Yeah, but in this case too, let's move back our unit. In this case too, we actually have to resize our GridSearchHandler because this one was for the demo configurations. Yeah, so same thing that we did with the terrain cache heights. We have the lower left corner, the upper right corner, and we probably want to copy maybe some of the values that we used there. Let's unlock this, and we're just gonna copy these two values, -2, -97, and then 200. Yeah, maybe like this would be better, and just modify this. Yeah, perfect. So right now our whole terrain is divided into these cells for searching, and if you have, let's say, units that are planes or like flying units and they're up in the sky here, and you worry that they're not going to be caught by the search cells, then the search cells will usually just like consider the X and Z positions. Everything that's within those positions, it doesn't matter what value it has on the y-axis, the objects within those X and Z coordinates will always be tracked by that cell. So yeah. Other settings that we can use here is the cell size. So this also depends on how you want to run your game and how many objects you're gonna have usually in the map. You can have a size of the cell that is 1, and so this is really not, probably is gonna perform much worse than a brute force search, because it's gonna contain at maximum 1 entity at each time, and that's really not ideal. We can also have a much bigger cell size, which would mean that we're gonna be looking at more objects during each search, but this also depends on the size of your units and buildings and resources, and it also depends on the ranges that you have for the search that your buildings and units have. So for example, if you usually have like bigger ranges, you might want to have bigger cell sizes, so you don't have to go through the process of like, okay, find me the neighboring cells and then search for those, and then find me the neighboring cells of those neighboring cells and then search for them. So you want to play with those settings, maybe not even at the beginning of your project. Maybe you want to go back if you feel like you're doing some stress tests with some units and buildings and you feel like some automatic search is causing some problems with your frame rate, and you want to go back to these values here and just want to play with them until you hit some good performance. For our case, I think it makes sense to leave it at 10, because I'm probably gonna have objects which have similar sizes and to these two default objects here. The next position I would advise to have it enabled. This one allows you to always make sure that any position that is given to the GridSearchHandler to start the search is always clamped within all of these yellow search cells. And so if by some whatever reason you give it a position that is outside here, it's gonna clamp it inside and then just like try to search for it, which avoids you quite a few problems with. For example, let's say you have a couple of units that are moving towards the edge of the map right here, and with the unit formations it's gonna create either a row or a circular formation. By using this clamp, we will not even consider the positions that are outside of the map to create the path destinations. We will just consider the ones inside. Yeah, And the final option here is for caching search results, which I would have disabled by default. And the reason for that is, let's say this unit, again with the example of searching for resources to collect automatically, it doesn't have a target at the moment, it searches for one. When it goes through the first iteration of searching for resources and it doesn't find anything that it can collect, and then it just like keeps doing that through like a 2-second, 3-second timer, whatever that timer is. And let's say nothing has changed in the structure of the search cells around this unit. When nothing changes, then this search will also yield the same result, and it will make sense here to cache the search results and just like give it back the same result, which is nothing is there. So if you have a game that goes through like periods of like no changes in terms of no new entities have been added to the scene, no movement of entities are added, then it makes sense to have them cached, because it will look at the cache first, and then it will look whether there is a request that has been the same as the current one, and then it will return the same result. But if, say, in the same case, we're not finding any result, and then we have another unit that passes through one of the other, let's say, we have another unit that is moving right here through another cell that this unit uses to search for its results, to look for valid resources to collect. And this unit right here is just like moving by. Every cell that the unit moves through is gonna be marked as dirty, and so any result that has been cached in that cell will not be usable. And so as soon as that request is being searched in the cache, it's gonna find that it has some cells that were used in that search that are marked as dirty. It means that some changes happened to that cell. One unit moved through them, a new building was built there, a new resource has been destroyed there, anything that happened to that cell, then it will be marked as dirty, and then you will just like be wasting time just looking through the cache and looking through whether cells are dirty or not, and then we're gonna have to do the same search anyway. So in case you have a dynamic environment with moving units and like a lot of changes to the cells, then you don't want this option to be enabled, because it will lose you sometime. Although not so much, but yeah, for an RTS game you want to have like the maximum performance here and there, and so yeah. So depending on the use case, this might be useful, but in most RTS games I would say not really. Yeah, otherwise right now we have our search grid sales in here, and I just want to show you something else when we start the game. So yeah, we're looking at this position right here, and if you can see, we have in the gizmos, it's no longer yellow gizmos, we now have these red and green gizmos. And what is this telling us right now? The green gizmos is what the camera is currently looking at. So all of these gizmos that are green in our game right here, the camera is looking at them. Some of them are a little bit maybe like only like a couple of pixels are in, but if a couple of pixels are in of one from one search cell, then it's all in. And so this also helps us, you know, to do stuff like specific systems that should only run when you are actually looking at the object will be running in these search cells. So yeah, and this is also useful for some debugging. If you have some problems with things that are not running properly in certain positions of your map, you want to see whether they're actually being recognized as a visible currently being rendered cell. And if not, then yeah, there's probably some problem there. You might want to contact me for that. And yeah, I think this is the basics of creating a new RTS engine map. This is what you want to do in the beginning. You want to import your terrain. You want to set the terrain managers. You want to have like your current like area for the imported terrain object. You want to set the layers correctly. You want to enable height caching and make sure that it's included in, the whole terrain is included. Want to have a base terrain that's much bigger than the actual terrain, and if your camera is moving, is rotating to the sides and it's looking at the sides and not entirely at the bottom part of it, then you want to have side terrain base objects enabled. Then you want to do the same thing for the grid search, and you want to make sure that the grid search also encompasses all of your terrain here. Yeah, so at this point, these are the basic configurations for your map scene. I think next we're gonna take a look at buildings. We're gonna take a look at creating a building. Probably gonna import one from this demo game here, and yeah, we're gonna start with the basics of creating a building. And before moving on to that, maybe you guys have some questions, some stuff in relation to the recommendations I gave to enable that field or disable that field, and so probably also get some water and answer your questions before we move into the next part. So yeah, let me know. Also, is the audio, is my voice loud enough in the last couple of minutes? Was that working correctly? I'm not sure if that's a joke or not, but yeah, sure. I will repeat. My question is: do you guys have any questions or anything to ask about what I was explaining right now for the TerrainManager? It's a joke, bro. Oh, okay, yeah. Well, people were saying that my voice was not loud enough, so I just want to make sure here. Yeah. Alrighty. I think at this point I'm just gonna move on to the creating some buildings. Maybe we'll create one building. It's alright. The mic is a bit muffled. Yeah, it's probably not the best mic out there too. But yeah. Alrighty. We're just... So in the beginning of the stream we also talked about this GameManager component and specifically the faction slots, and at the moment we only have one faction slot. We have no other factions that are in the game besides the player one, and since this is the player faction, we make sure that it has a role as the host, which means it's the current master player in the game, and it also has local player enabled, and the other settings for the faction color, the name, the faction type, the NPC type, yeah, which usually get overridden when we have a lobby scene, where you can choose the amount of factions that you want to have and their NPC types, their types and colors and names. But maybe Warg will add this at the moment. Yeah, let's go ahead and create a new faction type that we're gonna use for this demo. So let's go to our game folder here, and then we're just gonna go with factions and then faction types, and right click on the project, create RTS Engine, or to create a new faction type. Live demo faction is what we're gonna call that. We're gonna give it a name, something like live demo faction. This name would be in the UI, so we're just gonna call it demo faction, and then we'll give it a unique code or key. And when defining faction types, we can also define limits for these faction types. So a limit can be defined using faction like entity codes or entity categories, which we'll get into a little bit later when we create the first building. And by short, entity codes are a string that defines any entity uniquely, and entity categories is also a string that you can give to entities that can group them together through categories. And so you don't have to, for example, when defining these limits, you don't have to like mention each one of them by one. And after you define what entity codes and categories are in this limit, you just like assign an amount. So maybe you want to have a faction type where we can only create one Archer unit. You just like go here and then write Archer, and maybe we can look at the suggestion. This is the Archer unit from the demo game. We can add it right here, which will point to this prefab, and then we'll just create one. And so if a slot has the live demo faction here and it has one Archer unit, then it cannot create another Archer unit. Yeah, but for our current demo faction, we're not gonna be creating any limits. We're just gonna have it like this, limitless. And yeah, we're gonna go back to our slot here, and as we did earlier, we just assign the live demo faction. We can keep the NPC type as unassigned at the moment because it's not really an NPC, it's a local player that we can control. And maybe we can disable that local player option and start the game and see what happens if a game is started without any local player. So first of all, what we notice is that the local player here, the initial camera look at position was not at this, because usually it only looks at the local player's initial camera position. So we just like spawned at a random position here, and we can select things, but we're not able to move the unit because it doesn't really belong to us. And if we go to the console, we can find a warning here from the RTS engine that tells us that there is no local faction slot, or there is more than one, and therefore even if there is like more than one that is assigned as local player, none of them will be the local player. And it's just like a simple warning. If this is not the behavior that you are looking for, then make sure to enable one of the faction slots, and only one with is local player enabled. Yeah, let's go back and enable that again. And there was some error coming from a UI component, which probably is related to, let's check this out, probably is related to having the no local player faction when we close the game. and it's probably just some component that is not unsubscribing correctly from an event, I guess. So when we close the game, we get no error. Okay, now let's disable this. Go here. And yep, and then we close the game and we get the error. Alright, so this error appears when we have this. I'm just gonna write this down and fix it later after the stream. And it's right here. Alright, that's not a concern of ours at the moment. We just wanna create a new building and replace this cube building that we have at the moment. So back to the RTS Toon buildings, gonna go to the built-in demo, and yeah, let's try a building. Let's take one of these buildings. Which one? Probably wanna take like a something that looks like the town center that we have in the RTS engine. Maybe house, wall posts. We have the names here. Oh, we actually have a town center. Oh, amazing. Amazing. And there's only one town center variation. I guess so. Alright. Then we're just gonna go back to our scene. Right here. Gonna open these. And yeah. Building creation. Let's wait, open. Yeah, let's go to the, I'm not entirely sure what we have. So many RTS Engine top bar menus right here. There seems to be quite a funny bug that is happening over here, but I guess, yep, all of them do the same thing. All right. Oh, we have more. So every time, oh, I'm not entirely sure where this is coming from, but yeah, this is good. We have too many you cannot miss this. You cannot not find this. It's right there. Yeah, so we want to go to the top bar menu, whatever one you have. It's probably a bug with a new patch, I guess. And for some of these, the editor is not visible. These options are not visible, and for the others, they are. Alright. Yeah, so we want to go to the top bar menu, click on the RTS Engine, and then we want to open the editor, which is currently target RTS Engine it's not found. Okay. Well, there seems to be a bug with that menu, so let me write that down too. Bug with RTS Engine top bar menu. Alright, we can just like grab this and put it here. Not the prettiest menu out there, probably should be reworked at some point, but yeah. This menu is just looks through the entity prefabs that you currently have, and it just gives you a short introduction to them, like the name, the code, the categories, the description, the current icon, and then you can edit them, you can clone them, and then start editing the clone, or you can just delete them from here or create a new one. You can also do some search related queries over here if you have multiple ones, and you can also reorder these by the category or the code that they have. For us, we want to look at buildings. These are the buildings from the demo game, like those units that we saw before. They're all from the demo game. And what we want to do at the moment is create a fresh new building for our new town center, which would be using create a new building. Now we have this menu for creating a new building. We can call it town center, and then probably not going to give it the code town center because this code has to be unique among all entities, and this is already reserved by the town center from the demo game. So we're just going to call it maybe demo town center if we don't have a better name for it, and we're just going to give it a category. For example, we're going to give it a first category called it's a civilian building. It doesn't have any attack capabilities. We're not going to do that for it right now. And you can see as soon as we enter that category, we can see that there's other buildings that use the same category from the demo game, which we can take a look at here. And if we add, for example, military building, I think it is, then go here and then select that military building. So if it will also show us all of the other buildings right here from the demo game that comes from with the RTS engine that have all of these all of this category assigned to them too. But yeah, we're just gonna have it as a civilian building, and we're just gonna give it a description. This building is the main building, or just gonna say the main building of a faction. It creates villagers, something like that. And we can pick an icon for it, which at the moment I don't really have one specifically for that building, so I'm just gonna use the one from the demo game. So I'm just gonna look for town center, and yeah, even though it's not gonna look like it, it's just an example. And now we can hit finalize creation, and yeah, we can now see our building right here that has been created. And when we go to the project tab, the default path that entities created through the RTS Engine editor are placed at is project resources prefabs. And when we double click to open this prefab, we can see in the entity component, when we look at the entity tab, these settings that we just chose for our building, to have this code, to have this name, and to have this category and description, etc. But it has created it with the default building settings, which will now we need to update. So first of all, let's go ahead and bring our town center, the town center from the art pack that we just got. There should be one, yeah. Alrighty, just gonna bring it right here. Let's go ahead and remove this, and let's get this in the middle of our building. Yep, this looks nice. And back to the entity component, we can see we have a missing property over there, which the old model was attached to, and we can just drag and drop it here. And it's probably a good practice to have a empty object which has position reset, and then we would have this model right here as a child object of it. And then we can take this parent object, which is empty, and reset, and its position, rotation, and scale here. So we can, there are situations where we might need to like change some stuff about the model dependent on like maybe some components that we create for our own game, and we don't want to be changing the reference here or losing the reference here, so we might want to have an empty game object which is a parent of the model, and we'll just have the model underneath, and then we are free to do whatever we want with children of this object. But as long as it's centered and its scale is reset and its rotation is reset, we're all good. Let's look at the bottom position of this. Yeah, it looks about correct. Alright. Now we wanna, since we have a bigger model, we wanna increase the radius of this so that it includes all of the model. And we can have a value of 4.2. And in this case, we might want to move the town center a little bit to the right. So maybe we can zero this out and zero this out. And have this set to 0, 2. Yeah, we'll probably need to move it just a little bit. Yeah. So each entity in the RTS engine has a certain radius, which is the range that other units or other entities in the game would use to interact with this entity. So if you have a builder, for example, the builder would just come to build this town center, and it will find a position around the radius of the building to come build it. There are currently plans to have this this boundary defined also as like a box boundary or a collection of different boundaries, but the simplest form at the moment is using a radius, and this is how we define it to make sure that the building is within these radius boundaries. Moving to the second tab of this building component, this option would enable the building as a main entity, which is one of the like built-in features of the RTS engine. So imagine we have this building as a main entity, and then we go back to the game manager in our scene, and then we set the defeat condition to eliminate main, which means a faction slot is defeated when all of the entities that are marked as main entities are defeated. So if your game mode type is like if the town center falls, then the whole faction loses, then this might be a good setting that you want to enable. For our case, we're not going to enable that. Is faction locked means that this building cannot change its faction after it is created for the first time, so it always remains as part of the other faction. Because there are some functionalities in the RTS engine, there is also this converter component that can be attached to units, which can change the faction of target units or building depending on the settings that you want to define for it. So the init resources and the disable resources. When this building is created for a faction slot, so when it belongs to a faction slot, you can have it add certain resources or take certain resources or increase the capacity of certain resources for that faction. So for example, we haven't really gotten to creating resources yet, so what we're seeing here are resource types from the demo game. What we have here is, for example, let's pick the population resource, and we can have this, whenever this town center is created, it can add 10 slots for the population of the faction, so the faction can create more units, for example. And when it's destroyed, we wanna probably do something like remove 10 faction slots, so -10 there. Currently we don't want to add or disable resources, init or disable resources, because we'll be at a certain point we'll be creating our own resource types, and we're gonna go back to this option and update it. And finally we have the colored renders. The colored renders are a basic feature of the RTS engine that allows you to color the buildings with the faction colors. And so we see one of the elements here is unassigned, because it used to be assigned to the cube model that came with the default building that we created. But since we replaced that, we can go ahead and drag and drop this model right here. We can actually check out what materials it has, and it currently has one material which has one color, which we can color differently. For example, if our faction is blue, it can be colored with blue. We're gonna get it back to its default setting. And since it has one material and it has only one color element, the material ID for that will be 0 for the first material, and then we can play with like some transparency values, like how dark do we want the color to be, since we can assign the same color to colored renders on entities and buildings for the same faction, but then we want to have different transparencies or different shades and darknesses on all of these different entities. But for us, we're just gonna keep it at 0, maybe a little bit, since this one is kind of dark. You can have like darkness in the middle. And this second element here is referring to the under construction model, which when we enable it here is this cube, this small cube right here, which is the construction. It appears when the building is under construction and not finished. So this is probably a good time to actually bring a version of this construction model to here, and I believe the asset pack that we chose has something like that. So let's go back here, built-in demo. I think I've seen some stuff about construction. Yes. So all of these are construction models: construction, archery, tower, stables, farm. There is no specific construction for the town center, I think. I don't think there's one specifically for the town center. Yeah, we probably are gonna maybe pick some of these elements and just like put them there. Prefabs construction. All right. Before we actually do that, let's go ahead into our folder that we have for the game. Have a folder called built-in extension, and create a resources folder, and then create a prefabs folder. So for each unit, building, or resource entity, any entity with a prefab that you have in your project, make sure that they're always stored at a path that ends with resources and then prefabs. That's the path that you want to end the any of your prefabs with. And so we're just gonna take this and then take it to our resources.prefabs there, and we can get rid of this for now. And we can open our game to the building extension prefabs and open this. And now we're back to modify our building, but make sure to have them there so that the systems of the RTS engine would recognize them either in the editor or during the game. Usually it's during the startup of the game and not during runtime, but it's a good idea to have your prefabs end there. Yeah, so we wanted to import the construction elements. Just give me a minute. The construction elements, RTS tool, prefabs, construction. Yeah. So we can probably, these are construction. George House, Davis Tower. Okay, there's no one, not one for the, maybe, oh yeah, this actually works. This works perfectly. Let's bring it also as part of the builder model. Let's first delete this construction model that we have by default. And we'll just give this the same values over here. So the town center will look like this when it's being constructed, and then it will look like this when it's done constructing. And these are 1x1s, 3x3s. Okay. Maybe we want to make this a little bit smaller. Oh no, that's too small. Maybe like this. Yep, so that we make sure that it remains within the boundaries of the radius that we defined. How about this? Oh, this is actually okay. Can it actually be all of it within the boundaries? I mean, yeah, we can just make it a little bit smaller then. Alright, nice. Yeah, so I'm not sure. Oh, it also has, does it have a color? I don't see that at the moment. Doesn't have really a player color. But anyway, we're just gonna, if it would have a, it has a material here, and this material has a color for the player color setting, which is defined by the RTS model spec that we got from the asset store, but it's not really used in this specific mesh. So if it were, we can just like bring it here and then assign the material ID and then playing with the settings. You know, we can make it a little much darker, for example, or something. So yeah, right now we have our default model, finished one. We have the construction one. For the moment, we'll keep the construction one disabled. We want to have it disabled by default anyway. And finally, we have the building, and we have no specific fields for the building. So now we defined our building using a unique code, some name, and other settings like its description. We inside the models and the colored renderers. The second main component that you usually want to modify when creating a building is usually the build and health. The build and health component is one that allows you to define how many health points the building can maximally have. Let's go something like 2000. The initial health for it starts with 1. This value cannot be lower than 1. And if it's higher than the max health, it will be clamped back to it. Some default settings here can increase, can decrease, yes, and can be attacked. Yes, this building should be and can be attacked. The attack target position here is usually whenever an attacker is attacking this building, it will try to target the whole building, like the collider that is defined for the whole building. But on specific cases when we have units, when we have these units and with a smaller size and a smaller collider, we might want to have a specific hitbox that we want enemy entities that are combating it to target. So like an archer would probably want to target like the head, the chest, or whatever, and then we can just define an empty game object inside of the entity prefab and just assign it here. But in this case, yeah, we want all of the building to be attackable from any side and at any position. All of its collider, it's attackable. The next property would be for the hover health bar data, which is we can choose to enable the hover health bar that appears when you hover your mouse over the collider of the building. You hover that and you get a health bar that has a position with this offset. So in this case, for example, let's go ahead and create an empty object and have the height set to 4. So the health bar, when you hover the mouse here, would appear at this position, which is at the moment pretty good, so we're gonna keep that. So in the middle of the building, but we're gonna move it up, and then the size of it, which will be 111, but probably maybe for this building, since it has 2000 and it's like a big central building, we might want to have a bigger one with probably 2 for the height, and then probably we're gonna have it, yeah, we're gonna have a longer one. So maybe for units later we're gonna use smaller hover health bars, and for these, for buildings, we're gonna use different sizes depending on the importance of the building. The hit effect here is whenever the building is hit with, let's say, an archer sends one of its arrows towards it, an effect can appear, just like some damage effect, and for units that might be like some blood effect. But in this case, we haven't really gotten into creating effect objects or how they're used, so we're just gonna keep this unassigned, and we might come back to this later. But know that you can have hit effects whenever the entity is damaged. The hit audio here is an audio clip that is played whenever the building is hit. It can have a certain cooldown, so it doesn't get like played all the time, but we don't have any audio at the moment to assign, and yeah, that should be left unassigned right now. This right here, the build time field, is only relevant if the construction type is set to time in the GameManager component in the map scene. The build time is a setting that defines how much time in seconds the building needs to be completely constructed from initial health set to 1 to the maximum health when one builder is building it. And when there's more than one builder, we can define in the specific corresponding builder component the multiplier that will get this time down. And so when you have 3 builders, this time will also go down, but this time defines when we have only one builder building it from initial health of 1 to maximum health. At the moment we'll keep this to 50 because we're not going to use the build time, or we're going to get back to this when we actually create our builder unit, and then we will try the 2 construction types, which can be time or health, because builders can either construct the building by influencing the time that it takes for the building to be constructed, or just by adding health incrementally in times that you can define from the inspector as well until it reaches its maximum health. The repair costs. The repair costs are simply resources. So for example, we can pick one of the resources from the demo game, like for example, this requires wood to be constructed and to be repaired, and it requires 100 wood to be repaired. And this means it's not like the cost for placing the building for the first time or creating it for the first time. It's the cost that when the building reaches health of 1, when it's damaged to the point where it has health 1, so when it reaches health 0 it is destroyed, but when it has health 1 and you have a builder that wants to take it back to its maximum health, you will need to spend 100 units of wood. And when the current health of the building is like 1,000 out of a maximum health of 2,000, then the amount of wood that you would need would be 50, because the building is now at half health. And so this value here will be proportional to the current health that the builder started with when it's fixing and repairing this building. At the moment, we don't have any resources defined for our game. We're just going to keep this disabled. Moving on to the destruction of this building, we want to enable destroy object. So when it reaches health 0, we want to destroy this building. We don't want to have any delay when the building is destroyed. So maybe, for example, you want to have some effect where the building crumbles down and you're playing some animations, and you don't want the object to be destroyed immediately before the animation is played. The building will not be usable and it will not be functional or selectable or anything, but you will still see the model, and then you can maybe play your custom destruction animation, for example. Also, you might want to increase the value here, but for us, we're just going to keep it at 0. The destroy award is, again, a list of resource types and values that we can have. For example, if we destroy, you can see like there's some food in the model there. So when this building is destroyed, for example, the faction that destroyed it will get 50 units of food, and that will be added to their faction resources. But again, we're gonna keep this to nothing. Destruction effect is again an effect object that we haven't really gotten to, that is spawned when the building is destroyed. So for example, we have an explosion effect. We can attach it here and then have it play when the building is destroyed. And a destruction audio too. Here we can add an audio clip which will be played when the building is destroyed. The construction states of the building. Alright, so we have our building here, spawns at initial health 1, and when it's placed for the first time by the faction or by the player, it is currently in construction mode. So the states of the building are the ones that we consider under this list and not the other lists. The construction states we can have, for example, let's say we have 3 construction states. Each one can have a certain health range. So from health 1 to health, let's say 700, we have a first state. Second state would start from 700 to 1400, and then the last state from 1400 to 2000, the maximum health. We can also choose to use percentages, which means instead of inputting the health range directly as values, we can just start with like from 0 to, let's say, 40 to 40%. We have a certain health range from 40 to 80%. We have a certain health range, and then the rest. But we're just gonna keep it more simple here, and we're gonna use direct values for the health ranges. So for each construction state, we can choose to show different objects or hide different objects part of this model. So imagine we have progression for this construction state. So in the beginning, it starts with only this, and then maybe in our models we also have a specific part of the building. This well has been built, for example, when we reach certain stage. Then we show that well if it's separate from this overall mesh. Then we show that. Then we show this small hut or building, and then yeah, we can show different parts of the building until it's completely constructed. But in our case, we don't really have that. We only have one construction model. So we're just gonna keep showing that during the whole construction states, and we're just gonna have one element here. We're gonna pick, let's even start from like 0 to 2000, the maximum health, and then we're just gonna show this construction model. That's it for the construction states, and now for the construction complete state, or maybe in the construction states we can have for the first element, if this is not disabled by default, we can have our main model disabled by default, so that we make sure that it doesn't appear and only the construction model appears here. Now when the construction is completed, so as soon as the building reaches maximum health for the first time after it's placed, we have one state that we can show and hide objects in. So in this case, the health range and the percentage values do not really matter. What matters is only the show and the hide object lists. So when the building is constructed for the first time, we want to hide the construction model, then show the actual building model. One more thing about these health states is that we can also have Unity events that, you have your own custom scripts that are probably handling the states some other way, and then when this construction complete states enter, you can then trigger some behavior on your own components. You can also do it for any other health state here. Majestic said, is this going to be recorded to rewatch later? Yes, this is definitely going to be recorded. It's going to be available out of VOD and probably uploaded to YouTube as well. So yeah. And the trigger events, you can just like trigger events that you have in your custom components. So if you want to handle all of this state thing, you just want to let the RTS engine tell you in which range the health is at the moment, and it triggers some element. And when the building is fully constructed for the first time, now we don't really care about the construction states anymore. We just care about the states, the regular health states. And for this, we can define some states for the building. Let's say when the building has health between 0 and let's define 3 states here actually. Second state starts from 400 until, let's say, this, or maybe even this. Let's go with 700, 1700, 1700 to 2000. And in this case, what this means is that when the building is being attacked by enemy factions and it starts losing its health, we want to probably have a visual effect for the player and show him like some damage on the building, so that they recognize that it's being attacked, or it's at a certain point of its health where it's probably close to being destroyed, so it has to act fast to protect it or whatever. And I think we probably have some fire particles from the RTS engine. Give me a second. Yeah, perfect. Let's go back to our building. Yeah, fire. So let's go ahead and drop this here. This object we don't really need. We used that to explain the hover health data earlier. So we have this here. Oh, something is missing here. Oh, we brought the incorrect one. We need this one. This is probably not like the most suitable for this art style anyway, but to serve as an example, we can add something here, and then we can go and probably add some fire in this box right here. Yeah, so we have 2 of these. So when we go, let's maybe call this fire hut, fire corner, and then let's have 2 fires in the corner. And we can move this. The food is burning. Yes, perfect. So back to our health states. So now the building is not being constructed. It's there. It's doing its job. It's creating units. It's collecting resources. It's doing whatever. And let's start with the last state here. So when the building health is between 1,700 and 2,000, which means it has like most of its health, the majority of its health there, what we can do is probably nothing. Don't signal to the player that there is any damage or something that needs to be like taken care of very quickly. And so in this case, we make sure that we hide all of our fire objects. And if it has health between 700 and 1,700, then we can probably show 2 objects, 2 maybe fires on the corners, which would signal that, yeah, okay, we're actually like losing health. You know, it's not the main thing, and let's make sure to have these hot fire thing disabled. But when it reaches health values of 700 or less, then we can show all of the fire particle effects, so that we signal to the player there's fire on the hut, the main like area of this building, so they better be careful. And this is how the health states work. So depending on the health values, we can have different objects in the model that are shown or hidden, or we can also have some triggers here that will play some animations or any effects that will signal to the player information about the current health of the building. And the destroy states here is if we have in our destruction tab, if we have like a delay for destroying the actual object, then we can choose to have the effect of the destruction using the states of the destroy state field over here. And like the construction complete state, the health range and the percentage values do not really matter here. What matters is just the show child objects and hide child objects in the trigger event fields. But in this case, we're not gonna really have anything here, so we're gonna keep this empty. And the debug tab here, which has been added in the latest update, mostly in entity components and specifically unit components, they have better and more expansive debug fields. But in this case, this field just like shows you the current health of the building, which we will look at later when we start the game. For now, the game is not running, so we really have no building there to show, no data there to show. But yeah, so let's have these disabled by default, so they're not there. And those are pretty much the 2 main components of our building. We have an audio source component, which allows the building to play audio clips locally. We have a nav mesh entity obstacle, so when we're using Unity's navigation system, every building needs to have a nav mesh entity obstacle attached to its parent object, as well as a nav mesh obstacle component. So this nav mesh obstacle component defines the areas that will be carved by the building in the navigation mesh, so that no other units can actually move through that. And in this case, it was only defined for that smaller cube building, and we want to expand that a little bit so that it includes our current building. So we can increase this value to something like 6. Then we can increase this value to another 6. which is nice. Probably remove this a little bit, maybe. Yeah, this is actually much better now. Yeah, everything is still inside. All right. And usually with Unity's navigation mesh, when you define the navigation mesh even at the edges of the building like that, they have like a small margin, sometimes not small actually, but there's a margin that is also carved out of the navigation mesh. So it's not really exact, according to my experience, at least with Unity's navigation stuff. So we might wanna later have the building added to the scene, and then, I mean, we can actually do that now. Let's go back to our scene. This is not our scene. This new building should not be here. This should be here. And when we go to navigation, we can see that, yeah, it's actually a little bit bigger than what we have actually set. So we might want to have units move on those areas. And what we can do is, let's take this navigation tab outside so we can always have it available. And we can decrease this so you can see it's smaller than the actual building model, but at least it's more exact this way. And we have this as one too, which, great. All right, let's move this back here, and let's make sure to apply this to our prefab. And let's open the prefab. Maybe just, okay, let's not have you here anymore. Just get me into prefab mode. Yeah. And after we set the size of the navigation mesh obstacle, we can, we have to, in my experience, it's always good to enable this when we have stationary and static obstacles, to just like carve a hole. This will actually make this hole in the navigation mesh, and it's actually much better for units to not have, for navigation agents to not have the expectation that this obstacle might move or that position might be open at some point, and sometimes they start just like slamming into it and it all looks very ugly. And yeah, usually we want to have it to be carved. And these settings here do not really matter that much because we're not gonna move the building anyway, but they matter when you have like a dynamic obstacle that moves, and then how much time does it need to be static for, not moving until it carves a hole into the navigation mesh. But for our case, it doesn't really matter. So yeah, that was it for the main building components. Now the two other the next important component is the selection. So as we can see, the selection here was defined for our default cube building, and this is not the case here. So what we want is, we want to define selection colliders. In this case, we can do something like, the selection component can be also attached to the main object, but for just organizational purposes, we have it on a separate object, and we have the colliders usually also on separate game objects. So when we look at the built-in selection here, starting with the selection colliders, we have one. This one right here, we have to make it a little bit bigger so that it fits our building model. We have to make it a little bit higher, so maybe 2, and then we get it to 1. And it's okay if it doesn't include that part here. Usually when we look from this angle and then we select, it's gonna, it's only this part right here that's not gonna be counted, and it's probably okay our purpose. But if you want to be exact with your colliders here, let's disable this one. We can have multiple colliders, say for this part we can just like move it with the, yep, we can have a collider for this part, for example, and move it like this. Maybe move it a little bit like this. Then this collider would be only for this one, and then we can have another collider for this right here, and then another collider for this, and then another one for this, and then another one for the well in the middle, and then probably another smaller one right here. And then you just make sure to add all of these colliders to the list here, so they're not recognizable when the player clicks on them. It signals that they selected the building. But I would actually prefer to just have one collider, so even if the player clicks like here, because I will not be having any units or anything else that is moving through here, so I just want to have this whole area. When it's clicked, it signifies a selection of this town center building. So I'm just gonna have this set to 1, gonna delete those, gonna enable this collider. Oh, I have to, yeah. Yep. So this is our selection collider, and make sure that every component, every object that has the collider meant for selection has its trigger set to false, which will be also set to false when the game starts, when the building is placed. So, but have it like as a habit, have it set to false, and have the entity selection collider component added there, and make sure it is added into this list here. Second option here, this second property is like, is it active? Yes. If it's disabled, then we're not going to be able to select the building. If it's enabled, yes, we can. And if we enable this option, then only the player that owns this building will be able to select it. Other players cannot. A selection audio is an audio clip that is played when the building is selected. For example, I'm not sure if I have. Oh, I do have one, so we're just gonna add this and test it out later. I have a selection audio, and that is pretty much it for the selection. And when we wanna select a building, we wanna visually signify to the player that something has been selected, and for that we have our entity selection renderer, which is a component that enables a mesh renderer whenever the building is selected, and then disables it whenever it's not selected. And we can go ahead and also adjust the size of this one by increasing these values over here. Yeah, this should work. Yep. So when the building is selected, this mesh with the texture will appear around it. So if and it will also be colored with the faction color. So if the faction color is blue, it will also be colored with blue, like this. And in this case, we just have to input the material ID that we want to be colored, and since we have only one material, the material ID is 0. Otherwise, we can also have different visualization components that signify whether a building is selected or not. For example, you can have I think Unity still have those projector components, which you might be able to like project a certain texture on. Yeah, so like you can project a certain texture 90 degrees of the terrain, so that even when the terrain is uneven, you can have that selection texture rendered over the uneven terrain beautifully. But in our case, we're not going to use that. We're just going to use a simple selection renderer here. So there's multiple ways to do this visualization part. All right, and that was selection, the second main part of creating a building. Next, we have the building placer component, which we can find under the building extension child object. So let's take a look at this component. The first field tells us, okay, what are the placeable terrain areas? If we leave this empty, then the terrain will be placed in any terrain areas. But since we created a terrain area earlier, we're just gonna use that, and we're gonna tell the engine this building is only placeable under this terrain area. Yeah, we're gonna have this can place outside of border enabled, because we haven't really looked at the border component. It's pretty much a component that can be attached to buildings, which defines a certain territory within its range in the map, that tells the faction that, hey, if there are buildings with can place outside border disabled, then they can only be placed within that certain range of that building. And so in this sense, you would have to like build certain buildings with this component in order to expand your territory and build other buildings on the map. But for us, we're not going to use that component now. We're going to have this option disabled. And can place in enemy border, we're also going to have this disabled, but it doesn't really matter, since in the beginning we're not going to have any other faction slot other than the player. And here we can choose to have the building ignore certain collisions when it's being placed. In our case, we don't really want it to ignore any obstacles or certain collisions, so we're going to leave this empty. But the building placement process works by the player is placed in the building, and it's like following its mouse position, and whenever it enters in collision with an obstacle, another building or something, then you're not able to place it there. So it would not work. But maybe you have some certain setup in your game where you have colliders which have a certain purpose other than being obstacles, and then you want to add their layers here under the ignore layer mask. Placement audio is an audio clip that plays when the building has been correctly placed. And the debug here is there will be, if you have it enabled, we can have it enabled for the test later anyway. There will be a log message that is debugged onto the console, and this message will tell you if you are probably in collision with an obstacle and we're not able to like move to place the building there. So it's useful. So let's say you have created some object for testing it, then you forgot it, it's an empty object with a collider, and you're not able to place the building in a certain position because of that collider. You enable the debug, and then it tells you, hey, it's like entering in collision with something, so you would know what the problem is. But on release or something, you want to have this disabled because it's not expensive, but if it takes a little bit of computing power, of course, to debug that message and just like, show all of that. But we'll have it enabled for our example maybe. The two other components that are required for building placement are the box collider and the rigid body. So there's a different collider other than the selection collider that is used for placement. And this is the collider that detects obstacles where the building cannot be placed at. So we can have it, for example, I think we had it at 7 there. We can have it to be, when we look at the selection collider here, it's smaller than our building placement collider. And this is because we want the selection to be more exact then what we want the building, for example, to not have like a building that is very close to it or an obstacle that is very close to it, because for example we might have some position here, right here, where units are spawning or units are dropping off resources. So we need to make sure that nothing is being placed there. There's no obstacle, there is no other building, and it's a position that is accessible for units, for example. So it's always a good idea to have the box collider for the placement to be bigger than the borders of the building. You can also make the height here a little bit bigger too. And the rigid body is a component that is, you don't have to touch anything here, you just enable its kinematic and stop, because we're not actually going to use any of the gravity stuff from Unity. We just need this to actually trigger the trigger enter collision methods and callbacks from Unity. And you need to have its trigger enabled on the box collider, but it will also be enabled automatically by the building placer component. And we need to make sure that the box collider and the rigid body are both attached to the same object that the building placer is attached at. So it's always a good idea to have the building placer separately in its own game object with its components that it requires to run. And finally, we have the building components. The building components, and here we can attach like components for the building, like a rally point for when units spawn. We're not gonna have that right now, but we can also like organize the rest of the building prefab as we like. But in this example, we only have an additional component which is required for actually constructing the building. So we would have a list of worker positions. We can assign a code for this component, and this code must be unique within all of the entity components of the building. So for example, let's say the building has a unit creator component. It also has a code. So if we have like here code, those two components have the same code, which as soon as the building is created, it's gonna signal an error, and the RTS engine needs to recognize the components and its own system by assigning unique codes within the entity instance itself. So make sure to have a unique code over here. And otherwise, we can define how many workers can actually work on constructing this building. So let's say 4. So a maximum of 4 builders, which are units that have the builder component, can actually work on this building at the same time. And here we have two options. We either keep this list empty, not empty, but we keep these elements unassigned. So the transform elements here of this list do not have anything assigned to them. And in this case, the units will simply look for the closest available position within the radius that we defined for the building, and then they will move there and start working and constructing the building. Otherwise, we can define our construction position, call this worker position 1, because maybe we have a specific building that has in its model specific construction areas, and then we just like drag and drop it here. And as we can see, the RTS engine already recognized this as a construction position, and it's highlighting it using this gizmo and the debug, where it shows us that it has a maximum amount of 4 workers. There is no current workers, and it doesn't have the maximum amount, and we can show the gizmos here. But in this case, we're probably just gonna be good enough with whatever position the unit chooses, as long as it's available for them. And let's delete this then. So in the forced terrain areas here, we can also define that the construction only occurs at a certain terrain area. For example, the ground area. So if we have units, for example, on a different terrain, on like in air terrain, but they also can build stuff for some reason, they can also they have to be on the ground terrain in order to construct this building, else it will not be possible for them. So this might be useful, for example, if we have like a dock building and it can be placed like at the shore. We have to make sure that we can have like some builder ships or whatever, but we only want the units, the villagers on the ground to build the building. We can define the first terrain area. Yeah, it comes down to like specific situations, but the option is there, and yeah, you can use it when if you need to. And this option, the maximum amount of workers independent of the worker position field. Oh, this option allows us to bypass. So here we have an amount of 4. This option allows us to bypass this maximum amount, and this might be only just like what are the available positions that a worker can construct this building from. And then we can go here and enable this, and then we can have only 2 workers, but those 2 workers can have 4 positions that they can work at when we define them specifically. And so the workers will just like choose the closest position that they can find and they can move to and start constructing from there. And when we reach 2 workers, no additional workers can take the other 2 empty positions. In this case, we're not going to use that since we don't even have specific worker positions defined. So yeah, we're just going to keep that like that. And I guess we are actually done with constructing our building. This is great. Let me have a sip of water first. Awesome amount of water. Let's go ahead and place this building here and see what happens. Alright. So place it at position 0. We're gonna take it to our faction entities. Let's delete this building. And we probably want this to be rotated. Let's probably rotate all of this together just to make sure that everything is working correctly. We can have this as like this. Disable this, and yeah, now it's facing the correct camera angle that we have. And yeah, right now we have to make sure that it's assigned as part of the local player faction slot, and we're gonna have it assigned as the initial camera look at position. And let's hit play. So yeah, now we can see that this is the hover health bar that we created for the building, which is wider. This is the construction state of the building, because when we select it, we can see it has only 1 health out of 2000. And the building seems to be functioning correctly. We currently don't have a builder, but we can try to bring one from... Oh, this is actually going crazy on top here with the RTS Engine things. But we're not gonna look at that now. We can bring maybe a couple of villagers here, and let's make sure to add them to the faction slot. So these are villager units from the demo game. Let's hit play and let's see them working to construct this building. We probably have an error here. Key not found. The given key ground was not present in the dictionary. Oh, okay. So these villagers do not actually recognize the terrain area that we created here. So for testing purposes, we're just gonna add the terrain area that they recognize from the demo game so that they can work correctly. And since they both use the same layers, we should be okay. Alright, no errors. And look at the villagers. They started building the building already. And we can see the health increase. We can probably increase the time over here using this, the simulation speed. Don't worry about the minimap. We're gonna get to this some other time. It's not at the correct size right now. And yeah, as soon as the building reached the maximum health, the builders stopped building, and we can see it has its finished model right here. Thank you, builders. We can now also just go to the building health and override this so that the building starts, because it probably makes sense that we want our building to start with maximum health, and this is the town center, and the first building that the player gets, we're just gonna assign the initial health to 2000. Play the game. And we have our building at maximum health, and the builders don't have anything to do. So that's great. I'm just gonna get rid of these builders right now. Thank you so much. Just gonna go back to here. Now we probably wanna test attacking the building and showing the building states. So let's bring this Archer unit. Let's have maybe 2 of them, or maybe just like 3. And wait, let me, so we can like make this faster. I'm just gonna have 1 of them first. I'm gonna go to the damage component here and just have it just take 100 damage on buildings and units, but we only care about buildings here. Then I'm just gonna have, oh, maybe just like keep 1 of them since it has like such a high damage now. But since we only have 1 faction slot for the player, there's another way to define and initialize entities, and specifically buildings or units, to be free entities. So we go to the essential components, we go to unit extension, the pre-spawned free entities, and then we add our Archer unit. So the free entities are entities that do not belong to any faction, and they are just there. And you can have them, for example, as maybe you have like some treasures in your map, and those treasures are protected by certain monsters or whatever. And when you take, you want to take that treasure, which adds a lot of resources to your faction slot, you have to fight these monsters which do not belong to any faction. So yeah, that's what we want to have here, this Archer that doesn't belong to any faction. We're going to have it close to the building so that it attacks it as soon as the game starts. So let's hit play. And it recognized it, it's attacking it. We can see the health going down. And right now we should have this fire particles, which tell us that the building is under attack. Maybe we can speed this up a little bit so we can have the other one. Yes, we have the other one. And the building now should be destroyed. Alrighty. So we can also do some other tests here where we can define this building as a main entity, and then we go to the game manager and select the defeat condition to be eliminate main, and then have this Archer destroy the unit, the building, and then we can see what happens, which and the player should be losing the game when this happens, since it's the only main entity that is currently available. And yeah, we have this as player defeated. So yeah, our health states are currently working as expected. Our building constructions is working as expected. What we can also test is the placement of this building. So let's go ahead and say bye to this archer and make sure to remove it from this list, else it's gonna error out. We can bring a villager. Let's come back here, villager. Let's put it as one of the units in this faction. And then let's look at its builder component. And then the placement tasks that it has, and go ahead and create a new one. And for this new building, we will assign our town center as the prefab and have no required resources for the faction to build it, and maybe we can copy this and just like have one here and then paste, or just like properly, okay, let's just have one creation thing. And then I think we have a task here. We will get through to all of this at a certain point. Place town center, have no resources. We just want to see whether it can place it or not. Oh, where's the villager? Oh, villager, where are you? Oh, it's here. Okay, come close. Oh, so the villager is flying, which we don't really want. So come back here. So, oh, we can actually, the green color here means that we can place the building, and as soon as we enter in collision with another building, even if it's not close, because we have defined our building placer collider bigger than the actual collider on the selection, we wanted to make sure to have space between buildings. We can just like build it here, and then we can see the builder just rushing to construct it. So yeah, pretty much everything is working as expected here. And I think there's probably a problem with something that I noticed, the colored renderers of the actual building that we chose earlier here. Colored renderers, yeah. So it's not actually recognizing the color, which I think it's because this is a shader graph material, and the colored renderers logic is working with like regular materials, and it's probably accessing the wrong property for the color. So I'm just gonna note this shader graph material colored renderers. And I was already thinking about making a separate component for the like renderers visualization thing, so you can have one for like regular materials, one for shader graph materials, one that applies textures or like specific other properties, and you can extend them to whatever you want. But yeah, there's probably should be like a default option for handling shader graph materials, which this sounds like the case of. Yeah, I guess this is it, honestly. For the first stream, I think I hit the goals that I wanted to hit. We set up the map, we looked at the terrain, we looked at the search, we pretty much created our first building, we placed it, we looked at the building health, the states, the selection. Yeah, I think it's been 3 hours already, and I think I'm gonna stop here. Thank you guys for watching the stream. I hope that you learned something, and I hope that this was useful. As we mentioned, I'm gonna have this as a VOD later, and I will also have it uploaded to YouTube maybe, and I will look if there is any like interesting pieces and small chops that I can make to upload as smaller tutorials. But I think it's useful to like go through a lot of like these different settings of the terrain, of the search handler, of the building, and yeah.